Okay, thanks for joining. Just starting off with a bit of introduction on the the module and the course. So we are looking at covering the level 4 award in internal quality assurance and assessment of processes and practice. We're not doing the certificate because certificate is something when you do an external and become an external EQA. So we're doing the first part, which has basically the 2 units, which are mandatory units that we have to study in this qualification, and they would typically be 12 credits. So we'll be starting off today with the understanding of principles and practices, and then go into how do we work as an internal quality assurer or IQA. I think the only bit which is an additional unit we can add on at some point in time later by topping up in the qualification would be how to essentially look at planning, allocating, monitoring. If you have multiple EQAs in the organization and you are the quality manager or the lead IQA within the organization. Now, this qualification primarily has been set up by IQA very recently. It follows the guidance which has been provided by the Education and Training Foundation and the Learning Sector Skill Council. So perfectly acceptable, and obviously one of the qualifications in which I would say that you would probably get a lot of knowledge because it's just been written very recently. The qualification was released only in May 2023, so it has most up-to-date content as far as study of this qualification is concerned. Now, the minimum requirements essentially I would say on this qualification is for somebody who has been an assessor for at least 3 to 5 years and has assessed significant number of transcripts or assessments or different forms of assessments, and you managed it from a point of view of not just managing assignments, case studies, reports, witness statements, observation of records, even to a certain extent other forms of assessment, which could be either through group discussions, in some cases with special conditions and requirements like a scribe, for example. If somebody is severely dyslexic or is having a disability, then in those cases you worked with the IQA in your organization and the awarding body and taken relevant permissions to be able to allow a scribe in some cases to do sign-off type assessments or exams. And there could be other forms of assessments which are normally undertaken when you teach and deliver different types of units. It could be group discussions, it could be multiple choice questions, some sort of quizzes, role plays. So there are 16 different types, but over the years, I hope that most of you who have essentially looked at working and assessing a lot of student work, specifically within the vocational context, which is in our case, as a college or as a private college or something which is some sort of an institution which is in the higher education remit, wherein the assessments are normally a combination of vocational and academic. And in those cases, the role of IQA becomes important because you're looking at basically managing the standards, of the awarding body. So you are essentially a representative of, the awarding body in the organization. I would say eyes and ears of the awarding body or awarding organization within the, teaching organization or the trainer or the teaching institution. Now, there are 2 units. We're going to be starting off with understanding the principles and practices of IQA. The word IQA will be overused and abused, and so I'll try and restrict my usage of the word IQA, because obviously we're doing an IQA qualification, and in this case we're going to be talking about quality assurance standards, legislation, regulation, or the regulatory framework that IQAs are expected to follow when they teach, when they essentially assess and monitor assessors in their role. Now, each learning outcome we're going to cover in one session. There are some slides that have been prepared. They're quite detailed. And the reason of having the detailed slides is that all these slides would cover 95% of the information. I can't say 100% because there will always be best practices or experiences or examples that we will have to include from our places of work, or obviously in other places where we have seen this process working. So 95% of the theoretical knowledge would come from the presentations. Now, all of you, I know Reena has joined as well, so all of you have been given access to the Moodle, which is where what you'll be able to see is the course has been put up. By end of play today, I will have everything uploaded on the Moodle, which will include presentations for Unit 1 and Unit 2. and there'll be a template folder that I'll create here, which will be useful for us when I go along and discuss, to start giving you some templates to start completing certain tasks, and those tasks will essentially end up adding to your assignments at the end of it. Now, our plan is to complete this qualification before by end of July. So 8 weeks in particular, and the idea would be to try and get a visit done on 28, 29, 30th July, and then release the certification so that you have completed the process of IQA. Now, in terms of starting off with the first unit, what I would do is essentially take you through a couple of things in terms of the basic parts of it, which is looking at some key terminology and a video that I've shortlisted. Some part of the material that I've taken is come from Anne Gravel's website. She's a very well-known person, within this field, who has essentially, written a number of books on assessor and IQA and teaching side of things, but predominantly assessing an IQA. And some part of the theoretical framework actually comes from her books that we've got, and they would also be available upon Moodle, by end of play today, so that you have everything available as far as the study of this qualification is concerned. Now, one of the things that I look at, why we want to do a internal quality assurance qualification, or why do we want to step into the role of internal quality assurer, is that you need to be able to then, assess others, in terms of being able to assess standards. And why you would want to do this qualification is to understand, if you are in that role, then having a qualification and having knowledge and skills which are required for you to execute your part of the role and responsibility, in terms of carrying out some of the requirements which are set by regulators and awarding organizations. You would need to have those knowledge and skills, and that is why you would look at studying this particular qualification. So it is going to be a qualification which is going to help you build knowledge and understanding of how educators, trainers, instructors, teachers, tutors, if I put them all in different types of names depending on the different sectors and subject areas they teach in, they would need your guidance to be able to ensure that they are assessing and they are conforming to the standards set by the awarding organizations. So give you an example here. If I look at Pearson, for example, then somebody who's the quality nominee, they call it the quality nominee or the IQA essentially, but essentially they name it as quality nominee. The quality nominee is supposed to be aware of all the Pearson related, requirements of maintaining the standards within a particular center. And when we look at that process of you understanding what is it that requires Pearson to look at, say, for example, maintaining those standards, as somebody who works within the organization, they would essentially be looking at, this aspect of having this qualification. So if I put it this way, that Pearson, as a standard, as a quality nominee of Pearson, you are the eyes and ears of the organization within the center or the college or the university, and you are expected to maintain the standards. You are expected to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements, off-calls regulatory requirements, QA regulatory requirements in some cases if it's university. Then you are going to be their eyes and ears. And in order for you to execute your job and job responsibility, fully, you should have knowledge of and have the experience of working in this particular role, and that is where you will need to have this qualification. Now, just a case in point showing you on the website, this is a page which is created by Pearson, and this program provides forms and guides to internal quality assurance. So it is the home of quality assurance for somebody who works as a quality nominee. So in the case of Shazia, for example, she's the quality nominee at UK Versity. She would need to have access to this page. It is in the open domain, and it gives you all the templates, forms, guidance that is required for you to be able to manage this process within the organization. Now, there is an IQA guide as well, which is primarily a guidance document created by Pearson, which also is available. And that, if you do a quick search, it comes up, and there's an assessor guidance document as well. And that talks to you in detail. So these are basically the forms and the policy, processes that you follow. But that guidance document I will show you as well. actually gives you the full detailing of what your role is, what is expected from your role, how do you carry out your role, and what are the things that you need to be able to provide guidance, information, and share best practices with your team internally so that your center, your educational institution or the setup is actually meeting with that particular compliance set by Pearson. And Pearson's setting of this compliance takes into account the guidance which is given by QA, guidance which is given by the sector sale councils, guidance which they take as a feedback from employers, and all that would be informing them that these are the basic sets of responsibilities which need to be included to ensure the rigor of the qualification which the learner is actually achieving or the learners are actually studying. And your role in this case becomes quite significant because you are essentially the flag bearer of ensuring that the compliances, the standards, and the best practices are met. And if they are not met, then the gap areas are identified, and then you give obviously take action points or corrective action points along with your team to be able to ensure that these requirements are being met and these gaps are being covered. Now, there are certain bits that I would suggest that we look at in terms of, understanding very basic in terms of, before we go into the discussions on the unit. So, first thing which I would ask is everybody should know, and there's a question that will come into your mind which will say, okay, what is the IQA, process, and what does IQA stand for? So I know that IQA stands for internal quality assurance, but what else can you say in terms of what is IQA? Any ideas? Any thoughts?
Good morning. It's meeting the standard operating procedure, whatever been said
Yeah.
here.
It's looking at, like trying to look at the process of assessments and make sure that they are, like fair and that we're following the policies in place. So, you need to make sure that the processes that are in place for the learner are fair, and the whole aim of it, that it's consistent as well.
That's correct. So some of the bits that you have raised is going to be one of the models that we'll study, which is called WARCs. So you're looking at the assessments, but the word assessment might be more suitable for people who are looking at being an assessor or are assessing their work. But generally, these bits that you mentioned, Azia, would be covered under what are called the principles of assessment. So we look at validity, authenticity, reliability, fairness, and obviously, but going above that, as a part of that role that you would look at, would be to see whether your, assessors are essentially meeting the requirements given in the guidelines by the awarding body. So, for example, in some cases, you get these assessor guidelines which are given that are they following those guidelines? Are they meeting those, agreed standards? That means, are they assessing the work? In some cases, if I take a example of assignment, are they assessing the assignment to meet the guidelines as specified by the awarding body? So your role is going to be a bit of a policing role, which is the IQA's role, not to assess, but to look at how the assessors in your team are actually following the standards to be able to assess to a certain, I would say, level. So if it's at, are they following the grade descriptors? Are they following, for example, the guidance given by the awarding bodies? And those are the bits that you, as an IQA, are expected to, let's say, audit and let's say check in order to be in that position of the internal quality assurer role. So it's a process of ensuring learning and qualifications are meeting the standards, they are at the right level, and whatever has been agreed at the start of delivery, which is whether you made a curriculum plan or a delivery plan, all these standards which have been specified in the curriculum plan or the program specification, as we call it, sometimes when we look at in universities and you start a program, those are being conformed with and met in this process, and they are consistent as the words that we use. They are fair and they are reliable, so that when somebody comes in and checks, they are able to benchmark it against the standards, saying that, okay, yes, the compliance here I see is consistent with these national standards. The assessments are fair and they are reliable because the authenticity of the assessments are also being maintained either through learner declarations, plagiarism. So those are the processes. Now, why is IQA important within the organization? Why is the process of quality assurance important within the organization? Just as a general question.
It's because
in-
everyone
increase
needs
the
to.
transparency.
Oh, sorry. Go on, Andrew.
Sorry, Shadi.
Sorry, Andrew. Go on.
It's just a matter of increasing the transparency and follow the compliance as well. And as earlier mentioned, is the assessment process is a reliable, transparent.
Correct. So some part of it is yes. So meeting the keywords being compliance and regulatory requirements. So when I can translate that into higher education, that would mean meeting the standards. That means standards set by, say, for example, QA, standards set by Ofsted. For example, if I look at schools, primary and secondary education, if I look at FE, it could be ISI. And if I look at higher education, it could be QA. So basically what we are looking at is people who are working in this role are trained and are efficient to be able to detect if there are slippages in national standards or necessary standards which are there in the qualification. They are able to check and audit whether the center, the or institution, organization is able, training provider, whichever way you call it, is able to maintain the standards required by off-call, which are specified in the center agreements or some sort of agreements. Are they conforming to that? And finally, you're responsible for the team of assessors or trainers, instructors, educators, whichever way you call it, who are going to be assessing the learner's work and according a grade, or say, for example, saying this work meets the criteria or passes, then that would be the responsibility of the IQA to ensure that all these standards are now met. Now, a couple of other quick questions. What is an IQA? Now, this term used to be also called internal verification up until 2012 when the qualifications were revised. So we were doing D31, 32 or some sort of an IQA related qualification, which was primarily called the role of internal verifier or internal verification. That has been slightly reworded and renamed after the qualifications requirement were refreshed, and now it's called the IQA. So the IQA is the person who monitors. You're not assessing, you are not doing the work, you are monitoring the activities of the assessors to ensure that the assessments are conducted fairly. This bit of fair, reliable, and authentic, and the principles of assessment, which Shazia mentioned earlier, will time and again come in because that is our key role to look at whether the assessments are valid, they are authentic, they're reliable, they are clear in terms of their communication. There are no ambiguities when you actually communicate grade and when you make those decisions, and they are essentially reliable. So when we have this question of university or higher education institutions, when a learner can challenge that I've done my best and I deserve a merit or I deserve a distinction, so in such cases your role becomes quite vital, because what you're checking is that are the learners essentially submitting work meeting the requirements of the assignment brief, for example, and have the assessors actually then looked at the assessment criteria and the guidelines given, or in some cases the rubric structure which is there in universities for assignment, has that been met so that there is no ambiguity and there's a fair process of assessment and a grading which can be done. And that is what the IQA essentially monitors. Now, what is the difference between assessor and an IQA? I know that a lot of people sometimes when they look at this process of IQing, and because in all institutions generally what tends to happen is you're an assessor but you're also an IQA. So sometimes what will happen is you'll interchange your role, wherein you'll actually do some IQing for one of your colleagues who's assessing, and your colleague might be doing your IQA for the units or the work that you're assessing for some of the learners or a cohort of learners. Now, that is where the muddling up of this role essentially happens. So what you need to also be very clear about is that the role of assessor, somebody who marks the assignment, is different from the role of somebody who's in the quality assurance position. That means you are monitoring the standards, and that difference has to be understood. So sometimes I do get to see that when people do IQA and are asked to do IQA, they essentially end up writing 1 or 2 pages of IQA by giving an example, and they tend to do second assessment of the work. So that is not the role. So you have to clearly differentiate and start using the words which are going to be, showing that you are monitoring the activities of the assessor. So, for example, in some of the external reports, we see that when you do an IQA process, you would pick out maybe an assessment criteria and say, okay, I've checked are the judgments correct? So if the part is asking you to say, are the judgments correct? In those cases, what will happen is you will say, yes, I can see the assessor has confirmed the assessment criteria of the evidence presented in the assignment. For example, for task 1.1, the AC has been identified, and I can see that the assessment has been done to the criteria listed in the guidelines. Now, agree with the merit grade awarded, because then you are not assessing all the tasks or the assessment criteria in that particular learning outcome or the unit. And what you then say is agreed with the grade awarded. If you disagree with the grade, obviously there will be an action point for the assessor, because they might be marking too leniently the work that you see and you check to a certain extent to confirm judgments might be borderline. And if you're not happy with it, then in those cases, what you're going to do is sit down with the assessor, give them some action points, and highlight the areas wherein there is a weakness. So there is a difference between an assessor and IQA. Assessor generally is hands-on with learners' work. They are going to be absolutely hands-on with the teaching and learning side of things. So if I say strategic management, if I teach that as a unit, I would be thorough with that particular unit. Now, the IQA might not need to have subject knowledge or detailed subject knowledge in that area, but you would have subject and detailed knowledge of the standards which need to be met in order to say that the assignment for the unit at, say, level 6 or 7 passes. So IQA are going to be primarily looking at the overall quality and integrity of the assessment process. So you'll go into seeing like a plagiarism report. You'll also see whether all the assessment criteria are covered. You'll also see whether the evidence is sufficient. So the word sufficiency that we sometimes use is to complement that the assessor has looked at the evidence and has sufficiently identified that the evidence is detailed enough to be able to achieve this task or this unit. And that is where your role would be to second, to a certain extent, I don't want to say this, but that will be the role wherein you are not second guessing or assessing, but you are actually checking some of the judgments which have been done by the assessor on the assignment example, and that would be how you differentiate your role from the assessor. So when you wear the IQA hat, you are looking at standards, monitoring, auditing, and looking at agreeing. But when you are an assessor, you are actually going into the nitty-gritty of it to check whether the work is meeting the criteria, is it covering all the tasks, is the grade going to be okay, is the work borderline, and is the work sufficient enough to meet the evidence requirement of the passing criteria or the passing mark. So that is why the difference in these qualifications, that is why the difference in roles, and that is where I would say you have to be clear about in terms of how this thing actually works. Now, I've got a very small video that I want to play, and that will set the tone for this particular unit, because it will help define in maybe 2 minutes what is the role of the IQA. And let me play that video, which we'll quickly watch, and then we'll get on with some of the assessment criteria of this particular unit.
Where do real changes start happening? Break boundaries and transform what is in front of you. Flip your perspective to rethink success.
So let me just share that quickly. Okay.
Internal quality assurance should take place in education and training establishments to ensure the products and services are the best they can be. The product is the programme or qualification which the learner is working towards. The service is everything which underpins the product and supports the learner. If quality assurance does not take place, there are risks to the accuracy, consistency, and fairness of training and assessment practice, which might disadvantage the learners. IQA monitors the whole process from when a learner commences to when they finish. It can also take place prior to the learner commencing, for example, monitoring the application and interview process, to after they have left, for example, following up on progression. Internal quality assurers are often supervisors or managers, and are naturally responsible for staff, systems and procedures. Some are still working as assessors and performing both roles. That's absolutely fine, as long as they don't IQA their own assessment decisions, as that will be a conflict of interest. Some smaller organisations might only have one assessor and one internal quality assurer, which again is fine, providing they remain fully objective when carrying out their role. Some small teams, i.e. one assessor and one IQA, can swap roles and quality assure each other's assessment decisions. Again, it's not a problem, unless the awarding organisation deems it is. It could be considered a good way of standardising practice, as they will be monitoring each other regularly to ensure consistency. As a minimum, an internal quality assurer should plan what will be monitored, from whom and when. Observe trainer and assessor performance and provide developmental support and feedback. Sample assessment records, learners' work and assessment decisions. Meet with learners and others, for example, witnesses from the workplace, and facilitate the standardisation of trainer and assessor practice. For more information regarding IQA, just go to
So that summarizes what we've discussed so far, that, the role of the internal quality assurer is to look at managing standards and obviously making sure that the center is conforming to the regulatory requirements of the, qualification. So in some cases, this will be the, unit specification or, essentially the requirements in terms of I would say, assessment briefs or assignment briefs or, curriculum and program requirements. Now, just very briefly, if you look at understanding the first learning outcome talks about understanding the context and principles of IQA. Now, the context and principles of the IQA would be basically based on, 2 or 3 different words. First would be you need to look at systematic monitoring. There is evaluation that happens, and then you foster or basically create a culture of quality and excellence. How that is done, you are going to be following the awarding body, or in this case, the guidelines which are set by a regulator. If it's in the case of primary and secondary schools, it's Ofsted, so you have the Ofsted grading criteria that the schools are poor or average or good or outstanding. If you look at QA, you'll have review which is normally done once in 4 years, and they come in actually to check whether the team working in the quality assurance and processes side is able to uphold and upkeep the standards required to be able to deliver, teach and assess qualifications to the standards which have been set in the quality code. Now, they would essentially mean that you are looking at rigorously teaching and delivering to the details and depth which is required in the program. You are at some stage checking the assessments or the knowledge and skills which the learners are gaining, and that could be done by different forms of assessments. And last but not the least, when it comes to conformance with regards to how the assessment processes are being done or followed, then there is a set defined process within the institution. Universities define that in the program specification. Schools and other private providers, for example, would define it in the curriculum preparation that they do. And that would also have the standards or the reference to the standards that they are following with regards to those conformance. Now, when we look at going into certain more details of what these contexts and principles are, we are looking at, as Anju mentioned initially at the start, transparency and accountability. That means the process of the whole process of how teaching, delivery, assessment, and finally certification happens, or when the awarding of qualification happens within an institution, is fully transparent. That means it is auditable, it is visible to both internal and external stakeholders. And in this case, any such audits which tend to happen by relevant authorities can clearly see how these processes have been essentially run, and who are the people who are essentially running these processes. They are said to be accountable because they are the ones who are carrying that responsibility of ensuring all the policies, procedures, standards, compliances, regulation are all essentially met in terms of delivery of that qualification. You look at consistency and fairness. This is more so from a student's perspective, because when we look at higher education, it's all about one of the key aspects which HESA survey, actually a higher education students survey, which looks at is the quality of student experience. That means how do students essentially look at, let's say, grading the experience that they've had in undergoing or while they are studying those qualifications. So one of the key aspects in that survey is to look at consistency and fairness. That means the processes which the institutions are following, they are unbiased. They are basically not taking into account any sort of discrimination, and there's a fairness and equality. That means equality and the principles of equality has been applied all across to ensure that the results and say, for example, if there's an audit which was done, the results of that audit would clearly ensure and show that there is consistency and fairness in terms of carrying out these practices within that organization. Now, if the institution is large enough, you're going to see a lot of stakeholders. So if I look at UK Versity as a training provider, as an institution, we have maybe different heads in terms of stakeholders, but we do not have, say, for example, the depth of stakeholder participation in the whole process. So, for example, we look at there is a department which is basically looking after registration, certification, and bits and pieces in terms of ensuring that the grades are properly put, registrations are done on time, and things like that. That part department in most higher education institutions tends to be registry or examinations office. Now, in that, there will be many stakeholders. There will be somebody who's heading the department. There is somebody who's basically an examination officer. There is somebody who's a quality nominee. There would be a couple of people within that department. Now, if I look at teaching and learning, then in that case, you have different, stakeholders as well. You'll have say the group, I would say the course leader, somebody who's the head of faculty or that head of that department. If it's a university like law or business studies, you'll be having a head of department. There'll be different course leaders for different courses. Under the course leaders, you'll have different professors or assessors, lecturers essentially. And then in some cases, you'll have assistant professors, and in some cases, you'll have teachers or tutors, and you'll have study skill tutors. So that would become a full, department which you'll generally get to see, wherein somebody in that department will also be nominated as an IQA, and that person would be responsible for ensuring, there is active participation, sharing of information, but also the compliance in relation to following the processes and procedures to ensure that quality is being met, or quality delivery is happening in terms of teaching and learning within that. So there will be stakeholder involvements. If I look at from an institution point of view, stakeholders in higher education tend to be quality, something in operation. For example, I might call it business development, marketing, sales, but that would be clubbed as operation. There's teaching, and then there is, essentially the process of administration. So these four tends to be four pillars of higher education, whichever way you term it or name it as, but they would involve that reporting, sharing of information would need to happen, and they would have different committees which get formed. So in most cases, you would see, in order to look at discussing stakeholder involvement in the processes within teaching and learning, you normally have an academic committee, a quality committee, a staff and student committee, or a liaison committee, and they would essentially be stakeholder involvements as far as an educational institution is concerned. Quality would be one such key stakeholder. Either if it's a big organization, it could also have a quality committee wherein a lot of lead IQAs from different departments sit in that committee. It is headed by the head of quality or head of, somebody who's the head of quality assurance, and that would be that. Now, in some cases and some qualifications, you normally have evidence-based decision making. This is more true for research-based subjects, and in some cases, the IQA processes have to be quite robust, because you're looking at, so when, for example, Anjum Shazia or some of us look at supervising dissertations for learners at the bachelor's level or master's level, then in those cases, you're looking at evidence-based decision making, because you have to go through reports, understand how they've been compiled, and are the reports detailed enough, or the assessments detailed enough to warrant that they are going to pass, or obviously they are going to be graded. Quality as a process that you will see is something which will going to involve CI, which is continuous improvement throughout the processes. There are lots of updates which are brought out by QA, different regulators in this particular sector from time to time. And one of the things which IQA has to do is actually follow those updates and implement those updates within the organization that they are leading the IQA process for. So when you look at Pearson, for example, I'm going to try and stick to one example. You look at Pearson BTech HNDs, there are specification updates which come very often 2 or 3 times in the year. So as a IQA, you are expected to pick them up from the newsletters if you're subscribed. You're expected to understand what are the implications of those updates and then internally inform the teams or the assessing team and the teaching team that these updates need to be incorporated in terms of teaching process, in terms of assessment processes, and that would be one such example of continuous improvement. Now, if we relate the process of IQA generally to theoretical networks, framework, they would be, following Deming's framework of TQM, the plan, do, act, check cycle, which is something that we do when we create plans. For example, you create an interim IQA plan, you create a final IQA plan. So when your sessions actually start in February and September, when we look at universities, there would normally be a lot of planning which will be done on the IQA process, on the assessment cycle, on the and these would then be documented in terms of when are these regular checks, audits of the assessment process going to take place. And in some cases, when reports and external audits happen, which is external visits happen, and if there are evidences which are thrown up in terms of that these areas have been overlooked or have not been looked into, and that is where they have created gaps, then you would probably look at putting a PDCA cycle in place, which is, as an IQA, I always plan, I always do, I always check, and I always act in terms of ensuring that these processes are regularly reviewed and refined. So when you look at quality policies and procedures in an organization, they are reviewed once a year annually, or in some cases when changes happen in legislation. So when you look at data protection policy, for example, that Data Protection Act came out in 1998, but then the GDPR implementation of it happened in 2016. Now, how does that relate to an IQA within the organization? The relation of that is that because we are expected to keep records of assessments, for a period of 3 years, 4 years, and in some cases, awarding bodies say it's 5 years, then the access to those records, because it has personal details and data of learners, has to be restricted. So GDPR part of it had to be implemented within the organization, whether it's a university, college, or any sort of a training providing institution. In those cases, the role of IQA became important because the implementation of a major change in data protection policy within the organization required setting standards, defining processes and procedures to say who has access to what information, when do you get access to this information, and when you have access to this information, what can you do with that information, typically needed to be defined. And in those cases, IQA's work never stops, is because you would always be looking at auditing, checking any changes to such compliances, regulations which happen typically because of changes in legislation introduced by some of the regulatory authorities. So some examples of it typically tend to be in higher education institution done by QA, in vocational training provider institutions. It could be done through off-call when we look at learners actually studying with advanced learner loans or some sort of devolved funding. And in some cases, when you look at private providers, corporate training companies actually looking at this process, they would look at calling agencies or looking at getting certifications in like ISO or Matrix, which would confirm that they conform to some sort of standards in terms of teaching and delivering of these training programs. And that's the whole essence of essentially looking at studying the first learning outcome, which talks about understanding and putting it into context. What are the key principles and requirements of quality assurance when you carry them out in any organization wherein you are expected to take up the role of a IQA? Is that okay? Any questions on this so far?
No, that's fine.
Okay, now let's quickly get into some of the assessment criteria. There are 4 that we want to cover, and I'm just going to go through some of them in detail. Some you would need to read through because they are quite descriptive. Now, what it talks about is the first one says, explain the functions of IQA in learning and development. That is the first assessment criteria that we need to talk about. And this assessment criteria that we talk about in terms of the requirements of, what is the role of IQA essentially. But before I understand the role of the IQA, what I also want to do is I want to understand what are the functions that an IQA would carry out in their role. So that basically tends to be a range of activities that you're going to carry out, and they are going to primarily be coming in from the process or the policy or the framework of quality management, continuous improvement. So when we look at this as a as a function that you're going to carry out, that function would essentially mean that we are looking at ensuring that qualifications are delivered to meeting the awarding body standards and requirements. So in my role as an IQA, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to ensure that the monitoring and evaluation that I carry out as a process are going to be done systematically, they're going to be done timely, and these timely or monitoring and evaluations that I'm going to do will happen through a number of different processes. So in some cases, you would carry out what are called assessment reviews. That means you normally take up the IQ activity throughout the year, and what you do is you look at different assessors, you look at different qualifications, and if you're doing the process of internal quality assurance across a number of courses and for a number of assessors teaching and delivering those qualifications, then one of the things that you normally do is you pick up all the assessors, you ensure that all the assessors across all the units or qualifications are covered, and that is where you carry out what are called assessment reviews. Now, if you carry out these assessment reviews, what you're also looking at some stage doing is that there'll be new assessors or trainee assessors, as we call them. There'll be experienced assessors, and there'll be, assessors and IQA who carry both the roles. But when they're assessing, as Anne mentioned in the video, you cannot quality assure your own work. So in such cases, what will also happen is at some stage, if you're managing a team of 3, 4, 5, 10, 12 IQAs, then you're also going to be looking at establishing a key performance indicator matrix, which would say that, okay, you are measuring and you are conforming to these standards, you are looking at this particular standard, and you are looking at, meeting this standard. So how would that look at? When I talk about standards, there are 2 or 3 things which will come up. One, you look at student achievement rates. So if I'm teaching a particular unit and I'm the assessor along with a couple of other colleagues teaching that unit, and they are also assessors, what I'm going to be looking at the achievement rates in terms of how my assessment helps what type of learners. So one of the comments that you get to see from awarding bodies in this case would be that, most of your learners are achieving only a pass grade. Why aren't they being given developmental feedback to achieve higher grades if the qualifications are graded? So in such cases, what you would look at is key performance indicators against those assessors will be that you'll be looking at setting setting standards or benchmarks to say, how do I look at this assessor helping learners achieve better grades? So student achievement, one is whether they are passing. Second, what grades they are achieving. Third, second part in the performance indicators you would look at is course completion rates. So this is quite important in universities and FE colleges, wherein one of the things which the IQA measures and monitors is that if there are 20 students which joined in a cohort, how many complete the course at the end of the term, or how many are progressing towards the end of the term. So course completion rates is the second performance indicator that you look at. And in third cases, when you look at Pearson and university qualifications, most awarding bodies have put this into place now, which is the HESA survey, which is to understand, is the learner satisfied in going through that qualification? Are they happy, and are they getting a good experience in terms of the teaching and learning which they are having? And is their experience in terms of learning from the organization satisfactory or not? So an IQA role would not just mean that you will be looking at assessing and monitoring the assessors, but also we'll be looking at other qualitative factors in terms of carrying out assessment reviews and obviously setting performance indicators. If you are managing, or if you are a part of a larger team wherein you are able to then look at benchmarks and standards. One of the things that I don't need to explain is compliance with standards and regulations. So the key role of the IQA or function of the IQA is to ensure that you understand what the awarding body wants and how do you conform to those requirements. So you would need to read through the internal quality assurance guidelines, assessment guidelines which are, or policies which are provided, and that will help you to effectively, meet or help the institution meet the compliance. Now, the IQA process in the organization and the function is ongoing. It doesn't happen at periodic intervals. Depending on, in our case as UK University, when learners are able to join at any point in time, the IQA process is continuous throughout the year. It's a 12 months process. It continues every week, every month, every term, and across the year. So in such cases, you would sample different parts of work. You will look at different assessors' work. You will make those judgments and see whether the judgments are correct. And is the feedback developmental, or is the feedback allowing the learners to improve work? You'll identify areas of strengths and weaknesses. And what you would do is work on the weaknesses part of it by giving feedback to assessors when you give the IQA feedback to the assessor. And that is captured wherein you obviously sometimes put in an action plan. You sometimes say that these set of things have to be implemented to meet that standard. And that is what you also monitor and look at. We look at obviously you looking at attending trainings and conferences outside, looking at getting best practices into the organization, and that is where the process of enhancing the teaching and learning also to a certain aspect rests on the shoulders of the IQA. And then as an IQA, you are also looking at maintaining stakeholder involvement in whatever activities you are carrying out, whether it's monitoring, evaluating, including continuous improvement, or bringing across best practices from the organization. Having open communication channels is one of the other roles which the IQA will also do. So in this case, one of the things that I would say is when you look at documenting and reporting, some part of it is triangulation of evidence. So the IQA has to ensure that, as an example, the assessments are done within 2 weeks of submission, just as a policy or a guideline if it's been set within the organization. Whatever has been set, universities typically towards the end of the term do the moderation process, and that process normally needs to be completed within 4 weeks. And then the process is then sent across to the outcome of the assessment is sent across to a exams board. The exams board ratified, and then the grades are released to students. In colleges and other institutions, it will depend on how they have firmed up their policies. But the IQA role is to ensure that the documentation is comprehensive. Everything is clearly defined in terms of what has to be done, what activities have to be carried out before the grades are released to the learners. And in such cases, and the process would be to ensure that you have the assessment moderation done, then it is reported to the exam board then ratifies it, and then it is released to the student. So in the case of Pearson, what we do as a center is that towards the end of the external examination visit, we issue what is called notification of result letters. And these result letters then can inform the student that your grades are now in and they are with Pearson for moderation. And once the moderation happens, Pearson takes up to 4 to 6 weeks to be able to release certification. And in the interim, what tends to happen is the EQA, which is a parallel of IQA, but external to the organization, comes in, checks everything, ratifies that the judgments are correct, the standards have been followed, there is compliance and execution of all the policies and procedures related to assessment and quality assurance have been done, and the assessment processes and quality processes are robust. That's the term that they use, and meet the awarding body standards, and that is where they release certification. So those are the bits that you need to understand when we talk about functions of internal quality assurance. Is that okay? Any questions on this?
No, nothing.
Okay, now second assessment criteria talks about key concepts and principles of IQA. Slightly a repeat, so functions changed into principles. So that is where we need to know if I'm in the role of a quality manager or the internal quality assurer, I need to check, are the assessments valid? So we follow what is called the VART model, which is talking about validity, authenticity, reliability, fairness, and obviously consistency. And that particular model is something that you need to be aware of because you are going to manage and monitor assessors. So this particular concept of the task which talks about concept and principles of IQA is beautifully summarized in this particular image. So key concepts and principles of IQA, you are ensuring accuracy and consistency of assessment decisions. You're looking at supporting and developing your assessors and tutors. You're looking at ensuring achievement made by learners are judged accurately. They are not borderline. They are not lenient in terms of their grading. and they are conforming to the standards. You are ensuring that the confidentiality between the learner and the provider is maintained. That means the work of one particular learner cannot be discussed with another learner, and that is where you are maintaining, if there is any developmental areas, then you are maintaining that confidentiality. You're ensuring standards on the awarding body side. You're looking at identifying issues, trends which are developing. Now, if there are assessments which are done by the assessor and they are repetitive, the commenting becomes repetitive, for example, or it becomes descriptive, then that is the role of the IQA to pick it up and obviously then feedback to the assessor to say, how do you change your commenting? How do you contextualize it to the learner? How do you make the commenting more suitable for the learner? And that is what would be identified. Looking at accountability and then looking at, obviously ensuring correctness and fairness. And this would be through the process of sampling that you do, both interim and final. And those are the principles that you need to be aware of when we talk about VARC, valid, authentic, reliable, current, and sufficient, so that you are able to then monitor and evaluate your assessors accordingly. And I've explained that in individual slides for you to go through, which you can just read through to understand what are the key concepts and principles of IQA. And again, they can be applied in different contexts across HE, vocational training providers, and corporate training providers. Is that okay? Very quickly, the last two assessment criteria, I'm conscious of the fact that some of you are starting to teach at 10. So roles of practitioners. Now, when you've been in this particular role for a number and you're effectively, auditing the processes, you would be termed as a practitioner. I'm an IQA. If people do project management qualification, there is something that you also do, which is you become a practitioner. So you are very well versed with your role and the understanding of the processes, not just within your organization, but how they are implemented across your organization and from an awarding body perspective. So here, those are the bits that you need to be aware of, and quite standard in terms of monitoring evaluation. You carry out a standardization meeting every month, every quarter, depending on the size of your team and the people that you lead in terms of assessors. And that would contribute, to you understanding the role of your practitioner. So essentially, your role would be dependent on whether you work as an IQA, whether you work as an educator or an assessor, or a trainer or a teacher, or whether you work as a program manager or somebody who's the head of department. And if you are leading the education policy and strategy side of things within the organization, you might be termed as head of education or director of education. And in that case, it will be institutional leadership. And if some of us, we work as external, verifiers or quality assurers for other organizations, then in such cases, you're also aware of the external standards like accreditation and certifications. You know how to carry out an external audit, and you know how to benchmark that report when you create that, when you do the audit and you do the monitoring and evaluation, you are able to benchmark that across with different standards which are set by the regulatory bodies. And that is what is explained in this particular slides. So role of practitioner, depending on whether you are an assessor, whether you are an IQA, or whether you are a head of the education, or whether you are an external IQA, you would need to understand what the role of the IQA is in context to that particular part of the organization. The last assessment criteria is, it talks about your own area of practice. Now, for those of you who are getting into the IQA role, what I would suggest is, just as a very, very brief thing, pick up your own area that you feel that you're going to look at owning in terms of your practice. You have good knowledge, and obviously as a assessor and as a person who's stepping into the IQA role would be then looking at how do I evaluate and see what are the requirements I have and regulations I have in terms of knowledge that I meet, that I can step into this IQA role. So what I've done is, in my case, I look at IQing for strategic management and HRM courses for Pearson. So in such cases, what I've done is I have basically explained how I follow the regulations and requirements for these courses when I work for Pearson as an IQA. So in such cases, I follow the regulatory frameworks, I understand the quality code, I understand the awarding body guidelines, and in some cases, what I'm able to do is advise the institution, college, university that I go to, that are your assessors and IQA, aligning with the guidelines which are set by the awarding bodies. Is there enough stakeholder involvement in terms of committee structure and workings within the organization to ensure robustness of assessment processes? Is there risk mitigation done or risk management done in the organization? And towards the end, who is the person who monitors the evaluation of this quality processes within the organization? Is there a head of quality, or somebody who takes that responsibility is able to carry that out? And that part I've explained as my own area of practice for this particular task. So in your cases, you might need to pick up your areas and explain that, because it says explain regulation and requirements for internal quality assurance in your own area of practice. Is that okay? Any questions?
No.
Okay,
Thank
No,
you.
it's okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
good stuff.
Thank
So
you.
we'll end the session today. I think, conscious of time, that you guys are late for some of your classes, including myself, but we'll catch up, for the next session, and I'll drop you a message on WhatsApp so that we are
Have we
able
got a
to.
session tomorrow?
Good question.
I think
Let
we
me
have in the